Hey everybody, how's it going? This is MYR and I'm proud to partner with ReOrder and Armada University to bring you a set of sound design videos in Spire. We're going to be creating a bunch of sounds for Uplifting Trance. And if you like these sounds and you like these videos, go on to Armada University and there'll be a link here where you can check out the full bank that ReOrder and I did. We have over 128 different presets that we made. So check those out. It's a very useful bank and a lot of fun for trance and melodic techno. So this is the sound we're going to be making first. This is a lead sound. So I'm making this video after I recorded it. And this is what it sounds like. It's a big supersaw lead for Uplifting Trance. Let's go ahead and get started making it. So the first thing you want to do is start out with some sort of melody. And unfortunately, it can be tricky because you sometimes want the melody first before you have the sound, but sometimes it doesn't, you can't get a good melody unless you have a sound already in mind. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the demo MIDI from the template that you can get, and I'm just going to take the lead sound and just drag it here into live to an empty MIDI track. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just grab Spire. So I'm just going to go ahead and find it here under plugins and just drag it in. And I'm just going to rename this lead and rename this lead as well. So this is the initialized preset that you get when you get here. And I typically don't start with the lead sound, but I think here it'll be a good idea for us to get some lead first before we start building up the sound. So this is what it sounds like now. Let me just switch to arrangement view and put this in. So this is what it sounds like just by default with the initialized preset. So you get the idea. It doesn't sound very much like a lead. The first thing I'm going to do is take oscillator 1, and I'm going to jump the unison up to 9 voices. Now, you get these two knobs here that are really important. Actually, there are these three. You get the detune, which is the detune amount, the density, which controls how the voices are actually spread. So the detune basically is how wide the detuning is, and the density is how they're distributed, whether they're more towards the center or more towards the edge. So depending on where this knob is, it can sound more like the Roland JP8000, I think that's this side, or more like the Axis Virus. So I tend to prefer it more on this side, and then this wide controls how far they're spread out about the stereo field. So let's just listen to what it sounds like by default, and then I'll play around with it. Okay, it's sounding okay. The next thing I want to do is adjust the amplitude envelope. Now in Spire, unlike a lot of other subtractive synthesizers, you also get this STL and SLL. So you have your standard attack, decay, sustain, and release, but you also have these two things, which I'm not going to play with too much for this sound. So one of the things I find is your leads can sound a little cheesy if you don't have enough release on them. And I like actually bringing the sustain down and adding some decay so that it kind of hits sharply. So let's hear what this sounds like. That's sounding pretty good. I am going to jump the volume up a little hair. Cool. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to copy oscillator 1 to oscillator 2. And what I'm going to do with oscillator 2 is detune it a little bit more, and I'm going to keep the level down, but I want this one to be a very detuned layer. And I'm going to bump up the stereo field. So we're going to have one sound that sits kind of in the middle that's a little bit detuned, and then we're going to have a softer sound on the edges to give it some more side energy. can see that Oscillator 2 on its own, it's a little bit too much, but added with Oscillator 1, it just kind of gives it a little bit more energy. I think this at this point is a good time to add some delay and reverb. For your delay times for leads like this, I think you want to fill in the gaps. And most of the time your leads, if you're doing an arpeggiated trance lead, let me just fold this so you can see it, you're going to be playing 16th notes. So what helps here is to think about filling in the gaps that each level is playing. So this is arpeggiating the 1st and the 5th scale degree, and then the melody is really being played on the top parts. So these are actually basically dotted 8th notes if you look at the actual time. There are 3 16th notes, which is a dotted 8th. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm actually going to choose 1/8 and 1/16 to try to fill in these gaps. Let's see. So this color basically controls how much of the low end or high end. I like taking some of the low end off, and I'm going to add a little bit more feedback and take the dry wet down. So the dry wet controls the volume of the delay, whereas the feedback is how many delays there are, or how long the tail is. So from here, if you have a high dry wet and low feedback, you'll only get 1 or 2 bounces, but they'll be loud. Whereas if you have a lot of feedback and not a lot of volume, they won't be that loud, but the delays will happen a lot. It'll kind of bounce around a lot. And the thing I'm listening for, I don't want this delay to push it back too much in the sound. So that's why I'm not having a lot of basically dry wet here. Same thing with the reverb. I am going to add a little bit of the pre-delay, which basically, this is, I think, number of milliseconds that happens before the delay actually hits. And I want that transient of the sound, or the initial click, to come through without being washed over in reverb. So that's why I'm adding a little bit of pre-delay. The decay here is fine. This is actually a very large reverb. And I'm going to just keep it on plate 1 and just slowly bring up the dry wet. Sounding good. Now I'm going to copy Oscillator 2, and I'm going to paste it onto Oscillator 3. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm actually going to bump it up an octave. And I am going to bring the wide down a hair, and I am going to bring the density back and the detune back. Actually, I'm going to start it here on default, and 9 voices is fine here. And this is going to be a top layer. And this layer is really going to add a lot of energy to the sound. And I think a lot of producers I hear, they don't have enough octaves in their lead, and they wonder why it doesn't sound as high energy. And it's these top octaves that can really help. Now, you don't want to go too overboard with them, but it can help to have at least 2 or 3 octaves on your lead layered, so you get some of that low mid energy, your mid energy, and then your high energy. So one of the things you can do is click here and adjust the slope. I like a more, I guess this would be a convex slope coming down. And then just you have to bump the release up because it's not as steep, it's steeper, it's not as gentle. Always helps to make sure each sound is actually doing something to the sound. You don't want to just be adding stuff that makes it louder but doesn't add any character or color. So that's why I'm kind of muting each of these. And the last thing I'm going to do with Oscillator 4, I'm going to switch this to noise. And Control A and Control B on the noise oscillator controls whether it's a low pass or high pass filter and how much resonance there is. So I'm going to turn off key tracking, which basically means now this is like an actual filter. And we're going to bring in just some, I think this is pink noise. I don't think Spire has white noise. one trick we can do with oscillator 4 is if we bring it down to this yellow position, what we can do with envelope 2 is make envelope 2 be just the noise. So that way the noise hits with the initial transient of the sound and we don't have it washing over the rest of the sound too much. So basically yellow means it's not muted, it's not off. Red means it's on, and yellow means it's basically on, but there's no volume. And what we can do here is take this, and the other way you can do it is, I believe you can right click on it, or actually you can do it this way. We can take oscillator 4's amount and drag it to this box so that envelope 2 is controlling oscillator 4's amplitude, and then we need to move the amount. So the amount is how much this envelope is actually modulating this knob. So what this is going to do is basically close this every time a note is hit. So we're just going to bump this up. So if I turn it off, sounds good. This is pretty much it for the sound. The next thing we want to do is be sure we can close the filter. So right now, by default in Spire, envelope 3 is mapped to cutoff 1, which means when we close the filter, you can hear it actually closing the filter. You can actually hear envelope 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the filter all the way, and I'm going to map mod wheel 1, which is here in the envelope, to the filter cutoff. And I have to do this in a positive direction. So this means when the mod wheel is closed, the filter is going to be closed. And as I open the mod wheel, what's going to happen is, because it's positive modulation, it's actually going to open up the filter like this. So let's take a listen. Sounding good. I may add a little bit more amount. Sounding good. I'm gonna see if this warm sounds good. Now I'm looking at the EQ section. Doesn't really make a difference, so I'm gonna keep it off. And it does help to turn this as a multiband compressor. I find this really does help the sound. It's something that gives Spire its own kind of character. So I do like turning it on sometimes, but you don't want to go overboard with it because just turning it on a little bit can add a lot. See, that's way too much. Sounding pretty good. And the last thing I want to do is look at this EQ. Sometimes it can help to shelf the high end. So you got a low shelf, a mid shelf, and a high shelf. I'm going to go ahead and take the low shelf and bring it down a little bit. And this Q is kind of the steepness of the filter. So I'm going to bring it down and just bring the frequency up just a hair so we can shelf out a little bit of that low mid energy that may be muddying up our mix a little bit. I actually don't think it needs it that much, maybe just a hair in the lower end. So we're just gonna do that. Next thing I wanna do is just shelf the high end up just a hair. This can help just make the sound a little bit brighter. You don't wanna go overboard with this either. Of course, here we're adding some gain to the sound, so I'm going to bring back the volume off just a little bit. And once again, it helps to make sure this EQ is actually doing something. And last but not least, I'm going to take this mid frequency and I'm going to make it really narrow, and I want to just sweep around and see if there's a sweet spot I can find to just make it a little bit warmer or a little bit punchier. And sometimes this can be around 400 hertz. Sometimes it can be a little bit higher, around maybe 1000 hertz. The nice thing here in Spire, actually, you don't get to see what frequency you're adjusting, so you kind of have to do it by ear. So this forces you to listen and not just do the same thing mathematically every time. So let's take a listen and see where this sounds best. Last but not least, what I'm doing is adjusting the volume of each oscillator, just making sure we get a good mix. Once we turn that compressor on, it can actually change, because it's a multiband compressor, the balance of the low, which is kind of oscillator 1 and 2, and the high oscillator, so it can help to go back and just kind of readjust it. Honestly, that's sounding good. The last thing I did was just took out this low shelf. I think it was making it sound a little too thin, even just a little bit. So I'm happy with that. Anyways, hope you guys found this video helpful. In the next video, what we're going to be doing is making a sub bass. Actually, we're going to do a sub drone first, and then we'll do a sub bass. See you in the next video.